For 40 years, the nightmares of NATO commanders were filled with one specific shape. It was a low, menacing silhouette, squat to the ground, crowned with a rounded turret, and a massive gun that pointed straight at the heart of Western Europe. It was the T-72 main battle tank, the pride of the Soviet Union, the Kalashnikov of tanks. Soviet doctrine was simple: quantity has a quality all its own. They believed that in the event of World War III, they would simply overwhelm the sophisticated but expensive NATO defenses with a tsunami of steel. They built thousands of T-72s. They exported them to every ally, every dictator, and every regime that wanted to challenge the West. By 1990, the T-72 was the most feared armored vehicle on the planet, a symbol of communist military might that seemed unstoppable. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, he possessed the fourth-largest army in the world. His elite Republican Guard was equipped with the latest versions of this Soviet beast, the Lion of Babylon. His generals trained in Moscow academies assured him that these machines were invincible. They told him that the American tanks were fragile, over-engineered toys that would clog with sand and break down in the heat. They promised him that in a grit-and-grind fight in the desert, the rugged Soviet steel would crush the delicate Western technology. Saddam believed them. He dug his tanks into the sand, turning them into steel bunkers, and dared the world to come and get him. He famously declared that the Americans could not tolerate casualties, that the desert would swallow them whole. He was counting on a fair fight. He was counting on a slugfest. But the United States Army had no intention of fighting fair. While the Soviets had been obsessed with building tanks that were cheap and easy to mass-produce, American engineers in the secret labs of Detroit and Lima, Ohio, had been building something entirely different. They weren't building a tank. They were building a spaceship on tracks. Enter the M1A1 Abrams. To understand the slaughter that was about to happen, you first have to understand the machine. The Abrams was a revolution in armored warfare. The first thing you noticed, or rather didn't notice, was the sound. Every tank in history, from the German Tigers of World War II to the Soviet T-72s, was powered by a massive, thundering diesel engine. You could hear a tank battalion coming from miles away. The ground would shake and the air would fill with black smoke and the roar of pistons. But the Abrams was different. It didn't have a diesel engine. It was powered by a Honeywell AGT-500 gas turbine engine. Essentially, the Americans had taken a jet engine from a helicopter and shoved it into the back of a 60-ton tank. The result was terrifying. The Abrams didn't rumble. It whined. It produced a high-pitched turbine whistle that was surprisingly quiet, earning it the nickname Whispering Death. And it was fast. Incredibly fast. While Soviet tanks struggled to hit 30 miles per hour cross-country, risking their suspension on rough terrain, the Abrams could drift over sand dunes at 45 miles per hour. It moved with the grace of a sports car and the hitting power of a battleship. But speed was just the delivery system. The true disparity, the thing that would make Soviet generals wake up in a cold sweat, was the eyes. The Soviet doctrine for night fighting relied on active infrared searchlights. These were essentially giant invisible flashlights mounted next to the main gun. When a T-72 commander wanted to see in the dark, he turned on his IR spotlight. It worked, but it had a fatal flaw. To anyone with a passive night vision viewer, that spotlight looked like a lighthouse beam in a dark room. Turning it on was the tactical equivalent of standing in a dark field and screaming, "Here I am, please shoot me." The Americans, however, had moved beyond light. They had mastered heat. The M1A1 was equipped with the thermal imaging system TIS. It didn't need light to see. It detected the infrared radiation the heat emitted by objects. Through the gunner's primary sight, the world was a crisp, green and black digital landscape. A tank engine, even one that had been turned off for hours, glowed white-hot against the cool desert sand. An Iraqi soldier's body heat stood out like a beacon. The Abrams gunner could see through total darkness. He could see through the thick, oily black smoke of burning oil wells. He could see through the blinding sandstorms that plagued the Iraqi desert. To the American tankers, there was no such thing as fog of war. There was only targets. They could identify and lock onto an enemy tank from 3,000 meters away long before the Iraqi crew even knew the Americans were in the same time zone. And then there was the armor. For decades, tank armor was just a thick slab of cast steel. The T-72 had plenty of it. But the Abrams was wrapped in a secret. It was called Chobham armor, a classified technology developed by the British and perfected by the Americans. It wasn't just metal, it was a composite sandwich of steel ceramics, and in the HA heavy armor variants, a mesh of depleted uranium. Depleted uranium is one of the densest materials in the universe. It is 1.7 times denser than lead. By weaving this super heavy metal into the skin of the tank, the Americans created a shield that was virtually impenetrable to the weapons of the era. Soviet 125mm shells designed to punch through NATO steel would simply shatter against the face of the Abrams, like glass hitting a concrete wall. The American crews sat inside this citadel, knowing that they were riding in the safest vehicle ever built. They called it the Beast. And in February 1991, the Beast was hungry. The stage was set for the greatest armored clash since World War II. Operation Desert Storm began with an air campaign that blinded the Iraqi command, but the killing blow would be delivered on the ground. The plan was audacious. While the Marines distracted Saddam's forces on the Kuwaiti border, the U.S. 7th Corps, the Jayhawk Corps, launched a massive left hook. Thousands of tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles swung wide into the empty western desert, driving deep into Iraq to cut off the Republican Guard from behind. It was a logistical miracle. Moving an army of gas-guzzling turbine tanks hundreds of miles across a featureless wasteland required a steel river of fuel trucks and supply lines that stretched to the horizon. But they did it. And as they turned east to close the trap, the weather turned against them. Or so it seemed. On February 26, 1991, a massive shamal, a violent sandstorm combined with the smoke from burning oil wells to turn the day into a twilight hellscape. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters with the naked eye. Rain lashed down, turning the sand into mud. The wind howled. Inside their dug-in T-72s, the Iraqi crews of the Tawakalna division were blind. Their optical sights were useless. Their laser rangefinders were scattered by the dust. They hunkered down, buttoned up their hatches, and waited. They assumed that no army in the world could attack in these conditions. They believed they were safe until the storm passed. They were wrong. For the men of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 2 ACR, leading the tip of the spear, the storm was not a hindrance. It was a cloak of invisibility. Inside the turrets of the Abrams tanks, the world was glowing. The thermal sights cut through the dust and rain as if it wasn't there. Captain H.R. McMaster, commanding Eagle Troop, led his formation of 9 tanks forward. He was outnumbered. He was driving into the teeth of a prepared defensive line of the elite Republican Guard. But he had the technology. As Eagle Troop crested a slight rise in the desert terrain, the gunner in McMaster's tank shouted, "Contact front tanks!" On his thermal screen, glowing ghostly white against the gray background, were the heat signatures of Iraqi T-72s. They were dug into revetments, their turrets just visible above the sand. They were waiting in ambush, but they were looking the wrong way, and they were blind. The range was 200 to 500 meters over 1.5 miles. At this distance, the T-72's gun was inaccurate even in clear weather. But for the Abrams ballistic computer, 500 meters was a chip shot. The computer calculated the wind speed, the humidity, the air temperature, the wear on the gun barrel, and even the rotation of the Earth. It adjusted the main gun with microscopic precision. "Gunner Sabot tank!" McMaster yelled. "Identified." the gunner replied. Fire! On the way! The 120 or M256 smoothbore gun erupted, but it didn't fire an explosive shell. It fired the M829A1, a projectile the crews nicknamed the Silver Bullet. This was a kinetic energy penetrator. Essentially, it was a 2-foot-long dart made of depleted uranium thinner than a broomstick, traveling at Mach 5 times the speed of sound. It contained no explosives. It didn't need them. Physics was the weapon. When a dart of super-dense metal hits a target at 3,500 miles per hour, it doesn't just penetrate. It liquefies the armor. It turns the metal of the enemy tank into a spray of molten lava. The round crossed the gap in less than 2 seconds. The Iraqi crew never heard the shot. They never saw the flash. One moment they were sitting in their tank, listening to the wind howl outside. The next moment, the universe ended. The silver bullet struck the front armor of the T-72. It didn't just go through. It went through the front plate, through the fighting compartment, through the engine block, and out the back. The friction was so intense that everything inside the tank was instantly incinerated. But the horror was just beginning. The T-72 had a fatal design flaw that the Americans were about to exploit on an industrial scale. To keep the tank low and hard to hit, Soviet designers had installed an autoloader, a mechanical arm that loaded the gun, removing the need for a fourth crew member. The ammunition for this autoloader was stored in a carousel on the floor of the tank, directly beneath the feet of the commander and the gunner. It was sitting on a powder keg. When the American uranium dart pierced the armor, the shower of white-hot sparks ignited the propellant in the ammunition carousel. The result was not an explosion. It was a volcanic event. In a fraction of a second, all 40 rounds of high-explosive ammunition inside the T-72 detonated simultaneously. The pressure inside the hull became so great, so instantly, that the laws of physics demanded a release. The path of least resistance was upwards. The 15-ton turret of the T-72 was sheared off its ring and blasted into the sky. It spun through the air like a massive burning coin, trailing fire and smoke before crashing back down into the sand 50 feet away. This was the infamous jack-in-the-box effect. It was the signature of Soviet armored failure. Back in the American tanks, the crews watched in awe through their green screens. They saw the enemy tanks simply pop. 1 second a tank, the next second a pillar of fire, and the Iraqis still hadn't fired a single shot back. Panic began to spread through the Iraqi lines. They could see their comrades exploding to their left and right, but they couldn't see who was killing them. They frantically swung their turrets, firing blindly into the storm, their shells exploding harmlessly in the empty desert. They were fighting ghosts. The whispering death was among them. McMaster didn't stop. "Keep moving, don't stop," he ordered. The American tanks didn't just engage from a distance. They charged. They drove right into the middle of the Iraqi formation, firing on the move. The stabilization system of the Abrams was so advanced that the gun remained perfectly locked on target, even as the tank bounced over trenches and crushed bunkers. It was a massacre. In the span of 23 minutes, Eagle Troop destroyed 28 Iraqi tanks, 16 personnel carriers, and 30 trucks. There were 0 American losses. This was the Battle of 73 Easting. It was the moment the world realized that the Soviet Union had been selling a lie. The terrifying T-72, the monster that NATO had feared for decades, was being swatted aside like a toy. But the humiliation of Soviet technology wasn't just happening on the front lines. As the Americans pushed deeper, they encountered the command T-72s, the ones equipped with the best Soviet radios and sensors. And what they found inside those burning hulks would make Western intelligence officers laugh in disbelief. The advanced Soviet night vision was so primitive it required cooling systems that were prone to failure in the heat. The composite armor on the export models turned out to be mostly cheap steel filler. The mighty Red Army doctrine of mass assault was being dismantled by a handful of tanks that could see the invisible and kill the untouchable. And back in Moscow, the generals watching the reports come in were horrified. They weren't just watching the defeat of their ally. They were watching the obsolescence of their entire military philosophy. The T-72 wasn't a war machine anymore. It was a coffin. And the M1 Abrams was the nail. But the battle wasn't over. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the burning graveyard of the Republican Guard, a new threat emerged. The Iraqis, realizing they were doomed in a long-range duel, decided to try a desperate tactic. They would use the cover of night to launch a counterattack at point-blank range. They believed that in the confusion of close-quarters combat, the American technological advantage would be nullified. They were bringing up their reserves, hundreds more tanks for a final suicidal charge. They didn't know it yet, but they were driving straight into a trap that would turn the night into day. The Americans had one more surprise waiting for them, and this time it wouldn't just be the tanks doing the killing. As darkness swallowed the Iraqi desert, the commanders of the Republican Guard believed they had found their salvation. In the history of warfare, night has always been the great equalizer. It hides numbers, it obscures movement, and it forces armies to slow down. The Iraqis knew that the American air power was devastating during the day, but they assumed that on the ground, in the pitch black of a moonless night, the playing field would be leveled. They prepared a massive counterattack. Hundreds of T-72s, T-55s, and BMPs roared to life, their diesel engines belching smoke into the cooling air. They moved out of their revetments, forming attack columns, intending to close the distance and engage the Americans in a chaotic close-range brawl where their superior numbers could overwhelm the enemy. They were operating on Soviet doctrine, aggressive maneuvers under the cover of darkness, using infrared searchlights only when necessary. They felt the rumble of their own tracks and felt confident. They were the hunters moving in the night. What they didn't realize was that they were not hunters. They were neon signs moving through a dark room. To the crews of the M1A1 Abrams and the M2 Bradley fighting vehicles waiting on the ridgelines, the approaching Iraqi armada didn't look like shadows. Through the thermal sights, they looked like a parade of ghosts, glowing white-hot. The heat formed the Iraqi engines, the friction of their tracks on the sand, and even the body heat of the commanders standing in the hatches painted a picture so clear it might as well have been high noon. The Americans didn't just see tanks. They saw the exhaust plumes. They saw the heat radiating from the gun barrels. They could identify the specific model of tank from miles away. Inside the American turrets, there was no panic, no frantic shouting. There was only the calm, rhythmic communication of professional killers. The gunners tracked the moving white blobs on their green screens, lasing them to get exact ranges. The ballistic computers did the math. The crews waited. They held their fire. They let the Iraqis come closer, drawing them into a kill zone that had been mathematically calculated to ensure zero chance of survival. The Iraqis were driving into a wall of depleted uranium, and they couldn't see it. Then the order came. Fire at will. The horizon erupted. But it wasn't the chaotic muzzle flashes of World War II. It was a synchronized execution. Dozens of Abrams tanks fired simultaneously. The sabot rounds, traveling faster than the speed of sound, bridged the gap in seconds. To the Iraqi crews, the first sign of contact was not a visual of the enemy, but the sudden, violent disintegration of the tank next to them. One moment a T-72 was advancing. The next, it was a pillar of fire illuminating the night. Panic surged through the Iraqi columns. Where was the fire coming from? They swung their turrets frantically, searching for muzzle flashes, searching for anything. But the Abrams used a smokeless propellant. There was no flash, no smoke cloud to give away their position. The Iraqis were dying without ever seeing their executioners. The slaughter was mechanical in its efficiency. The Abrams crews fell into a hunter-killer rhythm. The commander would spot a target on his independent thermal viewer and hand it off to the gunner. Gunner tank front. Identified. Fire. On the way. Target destroyed. Next target. The cycle took less than 6 seconds. In 6 seconds, a $1 million Soviet war machine and its 3-man crew were erased from history. The T-72s, blind and confused, began to collide with each other. Some fired wildly into the dark, their shells hitting the sand dunes miles away from the American positions. Others simply stopped the crews bailing out and running into the desert, preferring to take their chances with the elements rather than stay inside the steel coffins that were attracting the invisible missiles. The vaunted night fighting capability of the Soviet Union was exposed as a myth. Their active infrared systems were not just useless, they were suicidal. Any Iraqi tank that turned on its searchlight was immediately targeted by 10 different American gunners. It was like striking a match in a room full of snipers, but the Abrams wasn't the only monster in the dark. The M2 Bradley, a vehicle the critics had called a death trap before the war, proved to be an even more prolific killer. Armed with TOW missiles, wire-guided anti-tank weapons, the Bradleys engaged the T-72s from ranges that exceeded even the tank guns. The TOW missile, tracking the heat signature, would fly for nearly 4 kilometers before slamming into the top armor of the Soviet tanks. The result was catastrophic. The T-72s were not just being penetrated, they were being shattered. The battlefield became a graveyard of burning steel, the fires casting long, dancing shadows over the broken remnants of the Republican Guard. The Americans pushed forward, driving through the wreckage. They didn't stop to celebrate. They simply drove over the burning hulks and continued the hunt. As the sun rose the next morning, the scale of the devastation became visible. It was a scene from the apocalypse. Hundreds of Iraqi tanks lay scattered across the desert floor. Most of them were missing their turrets. This brings us back to the fatal flaw of Soviet engineering, the jack-in-the-box effect. Why did it happen so often? The answer lies in the fundamental difference between Western and Soviet philosophy. The Soviets prioritized size and cost. They wanted a tank that was small, hard to hit, and cheap to build. To make the T-72 small, they removed the human loader and installed an autoloader. But to make the autoloader work, they had to store the ammunition in the only space available, a carousel on the floor of the hull, right in the middle of the crew compartment. The crew was literally sitting on top of their own explosives. There were no safety doors, no blast panels, no separation between the men and the bombs. When an American round penetrated the tank, which happened with terrifying regularity, it would spray molten metal into that carousel. The propellant would ignite. The ammunition would cook off. The pressure would have nowhere to go but up. Contrast this with the M1 Abrams. American philosophy prioritized crew survival above all else. The ammunition in an Abrams is stored in a separate compartment at the back of the turret behind heavy blast-proof steel doors. If the tank is hit and the ammo ignites, the force of the explosion is vented upwards through special blowout panels on the roof. The blast goes out, not in. The crew might be deafened, the tank might be disabled, but the men survive. They can climb out and fight another day. In Desert Storm, several Abrams tanks were hit by friendly fire or mines. The ammo cooked off, the tanks burned, but the crews walked away. In the T-72s, no one walked away. The difference in philosophy was stark. The Soviets built tanks to be expendable numbers on a spreadsheet. The Americans built tanks to bring their soldiers home. The technical humiliation of the Soviet Union didn't stop at the explosions. As American intelligence officers and engineers inspected the captured and destroyed Iraqi equipment, they found a litany of failures that shocked even the most cynical analysts. The armor of the T-72s, which the Soviets claimed was a sophisticated composite, turned out to be inferior. In many cases, the composite layers were filled with cheap filler materials or simply lower-grade steel that shattered on impact. The barrels of the 125mm guns were worn and warped, incapable of firing accurately beyond 1,500 meters. The radios were archaic, susceptible to jamming, forcing Iraqi commanders to use signal flags like it was the 19th century. But the biggest shock was the monkey model revelation. For years, Soviet apologists had claimed that the tanks sold to Iraq were monkey models, downgraded export versions with worse armor and ammo than the ones the Soviet army used. This was their excuse for the massacre. Real Soviet tanks would have won, they said. But the battlefield forensics told a different story. Yes, the Iraqi tanks were export models. They lacked the latest depleted uranium shells and the most advanced jamming equipment. But the physical destruction was so absolute, so total, that it wouldn't have mattered if they were the best tanks in Moscow. An American Silver Bullet going Mach 5 doesn't care if your armor is 10% thicker. A thermal sight that sees you in the dark doesn't care if you have a slightly better radio. The technological gap wasn't a crack. It was a canyon. The Soviet Union hadn't just sold bad tanks to Iraq. They had built a bad design philosophy that was fundamentally flawed in the face of modern precision warfare. The psychological impact on the Iraqi army was profound. By the third day of the ground war, Iraqi tank crews were refusing to enter their vehicles. They had seen what happened to their comrades. They knew that climbing into a T-72 was a death sentence. When American forces approached, they found pristine, fully loaded T-72s, abandoned in the desert, their engines still running. The crews had simply walked away. They chose to surrender to the drones and the helicopters rather than face the invisible executioners on the ground. This was the ultimate victory of the Abrams. It didn't just destroy the enemy's equipment. It broke the enemy's mind. It turned the symbol of their power into the source of their terror. Back in Moscow, the mood was funereal. The generals of the Red Army watched the CNN footage with a growing sense of horror. They saw their best tanks, the machines they had spent billions of rubles developing and building, burning like matchsticks. They saw the turrets flying. They saw the Abrams driving through the fire untouched. It was a strategic catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet economy had relied on selling arms to the world. Their sales pitch was simple. Our weapons are tough, simple, and can beat the West. Desert Storm destroyed that brand in 100 hours. Who would buy a T-72 now? Who would want a tank that blinds its own crew and explodes if it gets hit? The phone lines at the Soviet Arms Export Agency went silent. Countries that were considering buying Soviet gear suddenly canceled their contracts and started calling Washington. The devastation of the Iraqi army was the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet military-industrial complex. The Battle of 73, Easting, and the Battle of Medina Ridge were not just victories. They were a paradigm shift. They proved that the era of mass industrial warfare was over. Having more tanks didn't matter if your tanks couldn't see. Having bigger guns didn't matter if you couldn't hit the target. The M1 Abrams proved that quality sensor fusion and crew survivability were the decisive factors on the modern battlefield. The U.S. Army had gone into the desert expecting a slugfest, a grinding war of attrition that would cost thousands of lives. Instead, they delivered a knockout blow so swift and so one-sided that it rewrote the textbooks of military history. As the smoke cleared over the highway of death and the burning oil fields, the silhouette of the M1 Abrams stood tall against the horizon. It was no longer just a tank. It was the undisputed king of the desert. The T-72, once the boogeyman of NATO, lay in ruins at its tracks, a rusted, broken testament to a failed empire. The Cold War had been fought in the shadows for 40 years, but in the sands of Iraq, the lights were turned on, and the winner was undeniable. The American steel beast had roared, and the Soviet bear had no answer. By February 28, 1991, the ground war was effectively over. It had lasted exactly 100 hours. In that blink of an eye, the fourth largest army in the world had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The desert floor of Iraq and Kuwait was littered with the burning carcasses of over 3,000 Soviet-made tanks. But amidst this graveyard of steel, military analysts noticed something peculiar. They walked through the battlefields counting the wrecks. They found T-72s blown into pieces. They found T-55s turned into scrap metal. But they couldn't find any destroyed American tanks. This brings us to the most incredible statistic of Operation Desert Storm, a fact that sounds like propaganda but is historically verified. In the entire campaign facing thousands of Iraqi tanks and anti-tank missiles, not a single M1A1 Abrams was destroyed by enemy fire. Not one. The Iraqis hit them. They hit them with 125mm sabot rounds. They hit them with RPGs. They hit them with anti-tank guided missiles. But the result was always the same. The projectiles shattered against the Chaubam armor like bugs hitting a windshield. There are reports of Abrams tanks taking direct hits from T-72s at point-blank range only for the crew to feel a heavy thud, turn the turret, and vaporize the attacker. The beast was simply immune to the weapons of the Soviet Union. However, 9 Abrams tanks were destroyed during the war. But here lies the ultimate irony, the ultimate flex of American engineering. All 9 were destroyed by friendly fire. In the chaos of the night battles, blinded by dust and adrenaline, American tanks accidentally fired on their own, or Apache helicopters mistook them for enemies. But even then, the Abrams proved to be nearly indestructible. In one famous incident, an Abrams got stuck in the mud. The unit couldn't pull it out and didn't want to leave it for the enemy, so they decided to scuttle it. They fired a 120mm depleted uranium round the silver bullet into the stuck tank from another Abrams at point-blank range. It didn't penetrate. They fired another one. It bounced off. Frustrated, they called in the engineers to pack the tank with C4 explosives. They detonated it. The tank was damaged, but the crew compartment was still intact. Finally, they had to call in an Apache helicopter to fire Hellfire missiles into the open hatches to burn it out. It took the entire might of the U.S. military just to kill one of their own tanks. This story circulated through the Pentagon and eventually reached Moscow. You can imagine the silence in the room. The Soviets realized that not only could they not kill the Abrams, but the Americans barely could either. The psychological impact of this invincibility cannot be overstated. For the Iraqi tankers, it was demoralizing. For the Soviet generals, it was a professional funeral. Their entire military philosophy was based on mass. They believed that if you built 50,000 cheap tanks, you could swarm the enemy. They accepted that their tanks were flawed, that the crews would die, but they thought the numbers would win. Desert Storm proved that mass is irrelevant in the face of precision. One Abrams that cannot be killed is worth more than 100 T-72s that explode when looked at. The equation of war had changed forever. Quality didn't just beat quantity, it rendered quantity obsolete. This revelation had a domino effect that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself later that year. The Soviet economy was already crumbling. They relied heavily on oil exports and arms sales. Desert Storm destroyed the reputation of Soviet arms. Who would buy a MiG-29 or a T-72 after seeing them perform so poorly? Who would fear the Red Army after seeing their equipment dismantled so easily? The invincible Soviet bear was revealed to be a sick old circus animal. The technological gap that the U.S. had built in the 1980s, stealth thermal imaging GPS composite armor, was not just a step forward. It was a leap into a new generation of warfare. But the legacy of this conflict extends far beyond 1991. It haunts the battlefields of today. Look at the modern conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. We still see T-72s, and we still see them exploding. The jack-in-the-box effect, the flying turret, is still the signature of Russian armor. Despite decades of supposed upgrades and modernization packages, the fundamental flaw remains. The ammo is still under the crew. The philosophy hasn't changed. Meanwhile, the M1 Abrams is still serving, still evolving, and still carrying the reputation earned in the sands of 1991. There is a poignant story about the end of the war. An Iraqi general captured by U.S. forces was being interrogated. The American officer asked him why his men surrendered so quickly after the ground war started. The general pointed to a map of the desert. He said, "During the Iran-Iraq War, we fought for 8 years. We learned to fight in the day and rest at night. We learned that the night was safe. But when we fought you, the night was worse. You owned the night. And when an enemy owns the dark, he owns your fear." In the end, the Battle of 73, Easting, and the annihilation of the Iraqi armor was not just a victory for the United States. It was the final exam of the Cold War. For 40 years, two superpowers spent trillions of dollars preparing for a clash of titans. They built thousands of nukes, ships, and tanks. But when the clash finally happened by proxy in the desert, it wasn't a fight. It was a statement. The statement was simple: American steel, forged in the fires of capitalism and innovation, was superior. The T-72 was a weapon of terror designed to oppress. The Abrams was a weapon of dominance designed to protect. As the smoke cleared over the highway of death, revealing miles of twisted, burning Soviet metal, the world understood that a new era had begun. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, just months after their tanks burned in Iraq. The Cold War was over, and the winner was the nation that decided that the life of a tanker was worth more than the cost of the tank. The king of the desert had ascended to his throne, and he has never left it.